So James Ellroy, whose birth name was Earl Ellroy, the Lee I just referred to, in telling his story, it makes sense to start with the thing that defined him the most, the murder of his mother, and how that spawned his obsessions. It was a trauma that still persists to this day, as childhood traumas often do. Start with that murder in 1958, which is still unsolved, and then double back and tell the story of his parents, and particularly how Jean got to be in that bar in Almonte, where shortly before she met her dreadful fate. Now, Armand, Ellroy's father, was born right at the end of the 19th century, and if you go, the first few chapters really focus on their story. So if you go forward from Armand and Jean's story, you're really covering all of 20th century literature until you get to the end of the book, today, or near enough today. You're going through 120 years of American history. And against the backdrop of that, you've got the historical events of the time, such as Armand's service in the American military in World War I. You've got Armand was a Hollywood fixer, and his shining moment was his brief period as Rita Hayworth's business manager, during which time he organized her wedding to Prince Ali Khan in the south of France. And then the story of Jean, this plain but beautiful Midwestern girl who grows up in a small town in Wisconsin, and then makes her way to nursing college in Chicago, goes to LA for a beauty contest, settles in LA, meets Armand. She has a mysterious marriage slightly prior to Armand to a real estate heir. That doesn't last very long, but she meets Armand. He's a Hollywood figure. She thinks he's a handsome man. She thinks he's this great figure. Their marriage comes unstuck quickly. They have a son, and then you get to the murder, and then you get to the story of little Lee's life. Let's just call him James for clarity's sake. And you go through James's life story, because once he's orphaned, he lived with his father after Jean's murder. His father died a few years later. And once he's orphaned, he goes into this terrible spiral of drink and drug abuse, homelessness, committing crimes. He does time in the Los Angeles County Jail. But against that backdrop, you've got things like Vietnam. Ellroy very nearly served in Vietnam. He was very lucky to get out of that. He faked a nervous breakdown to get out of the army. He joined up to the army in a moment of madness and soon realized that the army wasn't for him. But you've got, again in the backdrop, you've got the Charles Manson family murders, which had a profound effect on Ellroy, because at the time he was breaking into houses, and then suddenly the beautiful actress Sharon Tate is murdered brutally. Another members of LA high society and was murdered by the Manson family, and suddenly Ellroy had been breaking into houses partly for somewhere to stay, or partly to do other unsavory things. Nothing too grisly, but suddenly Ellroy begins to see all these sophisticated burglary alarms, because LA was in the grip of this wave of paranoia. So you really go through the whole of the 20th century in the Ellroy family story. Now, to get to the place where I might be able to tell that story, I know Ellroy well. I've known him since about 2009 in person, and I've written previous books on him. And obviously, the previous books, being quite academic, they have some slightly limited appeal outside the library market. I thought, okay, the next one's going to be the big one. The next one's going to be the one that really tells his story in a really page-turning way. And I was, in the latter half of 2019, I was preparing to make a pitch to Bloomsbury, which I thought was pretty strong. But I realized that there could be competition for this post. And Ellroy had made comments in the New York Times. Someone had asked him, who would be your ideal biographer? And he said, well, Adam Sisman, who was John le Carre's biographer, or Tom Nolan, who was Ross MacDonald's biographer. And I was just like, oh dear, I've got competition for this. So I'm frantically trying to get the deal in place. Bloomsbury offers me the contract January 2020. That was great timing, because a few months later, COVID was destroying everything. Probably wouldn't have been handed to me a few months later. And I call up Ellroy. I've got his number. I don't speak to him very often, but I call him up. I leave a message and say, look, I'm writing a story for Bloomsbury. Let's talk about it. So obviously Sylvie, I forgot to leave my number. And the next day, the English department's at the University of Liverpool where I work, the English department's on the phone saying, Steve, James Ellroy's been on the phone for you. And so I get back and call him back, and immediately he's delighted. He wants me to tell his story. He's going to cooperate. Okay, everything's falling into place. There was a slight complication. He'd come to an agreement with Tom Nolan, the biographer he previously mentioned. Nolan had approached him in a bookshop with a copy of the New York Times profile under his arm and said, "Were you serious about this? Do you want me to write a biography?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm serious." Unfortunately, they hadn't hit it off from day one. And Ellroy was saying to me, "Look, forget Nolan, he's finished, he's history. Just forget him. The minute I hang up, I'm going to fire him." It's just like, he was a good-looking guy back in the 60s, not such a good-looking guy now, Steve. And then he's just like, look, he looks like he could be my granddad. He looks like he could be your great-great-great-granddad. So I'm just going to fire him. I was like, please, just a little bit. I don't want to cause any undue pain towards anyone. But that's publishing. So we get to work. We had a prior relationship. We have a good working relationship. And I knew that it would require not just hundreds of hours of talking to Ellroy, but many, many hours talking to everybody who I could in his life who would talk to me. That included his many, many ex-partners. And I knew from his second memoir that he claimed over 100. Some of them were extremely fleeting, but the principal ones I would need to talk to the ex-girlfriends, and he was quite helpful that way. So that required playing detective, because then I've got to find people. I've got to study property records to find people, marriage records, divorce records. Finding women's harder because women tend to change their name a lot. So study college yearbooks, electoral registers, anything I can study to find people and approach them. And luckily, most of the people I approached were very, very conducive to talking to me and sharing their memories of Ellroy. Aside from that, there were many, prominent novelists I needed to talk to who'd known him. Some of them are very major figures. One was Ian Rankin, and these were at the height of lockdown, so most of these were, by Zoom. But Ian Rankin was great, so whenever I talk to somebody, I'm always a bit nervous. But he comes up on my Zoom screen, he's got his chin, and he's like this. Mr. Rankin, I'm very happy to be talking to you. And he's like, "I'll soon change that." But he was wonderful. And David Peace, the British novelist who wrote The Damned United, who lives in Japan, and he was absolutely amazing. I was just like, "Oh, David, you're the 70th person I've talked to so far." I said, "Let's see, I've talked to Ellroy's ex-girlfriends." He's like, "Were they the other 69?" So there were many great moments, and of course Hollywood people as well. So talking to Hollywood people, it can be tough. I mean, it's easy to find out where they are, but then you've got to get past their lawyers and their managers and their agents, and you've got to just keep knocking at the door until you feel like you're practically a stalker. But eventually you land a meeting, and all I can say is that in Hollywood, getting a meeting is an achievement, making a movie is a miracle. But it is like the Woody Allen film Annie Hall, where they say you have very good meetings, and they did have very good meetings with, for instance, the actress Dana Delaney, who, just to give you some background, Dana Delaney and Ellroy were friends for many years, and their friendship was gossip. Two good-looking people, and so I was a bit nervous. So I think Dana Delaney is one of the world's most beautiful women. But the day I was due to talk to her, my wife was teasing me, saying, "Oh, you're going to ask her to marry you and all this." And then I started talking to her. I found out that's exactly what Ellroy did. He did ask her to marry him. But if you want the full story of their relationship, you have to. There was also again sometimes. Your relationship, if you're writing anything that's relatively an authorized biography, your relationship with your subject, even if he's very helpful, can sometimes be a little kind of a dance in terms of you kind of tiptoe around each other. And Ellroy told me about a girlfriend of his I was quite keen on talking to. Let's just say her name is Smith, or maybe it was Jones, or maybe it was Evans. She had a common name. And he told me that she wrote Pirates of the Caribbean, and in typical Hollywood style, she got screwed out of the deal. So, but her name was quite a commonplace name. I thought, I'm never going to find her. And then through a stroke of luck, I saw in the Pirates of the Caribbean credits, creative consultant, and the name, and I thought, oh, great, I found her. And word must have been getting round on in Hollywood about the interviews about Ellroy and the biography, because I followed her on Twitter, and then 2 minutes later I get a message saying, Dr. Powell, I've been expecting you. And she was wonderful. And another great one was two friends of Ellroy, a Hollywood golden couple. A lot of the times you'll recognize the work, you won't recognize the name, but the producer Clark Peterson, who produced Monster with Charlize Theron, just to do some terrible name dropping for you, and his wife, the screenwriter Stacey Rukeyser, who writes Sex Life for Netflix. And the good thing about contacting writers is that's dead easy, because any writer at the Writers Guild of America, you get direct form that goes to them directly. So I contacted Stacey Rukeyser, and she said, oh, I'm so pleased, a fellow writer. Look, it's Clark, my husband was Ellroy's buddy. You need to talk to him. I'm giving you his email. All the best for your project. She was lovely. So I emailed Clark. He didn't respond. Emailed again. He didn't respond. Emailed him a third time. So I get desperate now. He didn't respond. So I emailed Stacey back. I said, I'm sorry, your husband hasn't responded. So we go. And within half an hour, he responded. He's like, hey, Steve, buddy. Anytime you want to meet, I'm sorry I haven't got back to you. I'm so sorry. Just you name the time, you name the place. And I was just like, right, okay. So I know who has the trousers in that relationship. But so the interviews were absolutely crucial. I would prep Ellroy, particularly if I was going to speak to an ex-girlfriend of his beforehand. And I would say to him, like, I'm talking to Cindy on Sunday, could you tell me about Cindy? And he's just like, oh, she was the one that got away. Her song was Image of a Girl by the Safaris. And so I spoke to Cindy, and because she was lovely and gracious, and I said, oh, we mentioned something, that your song was Image of a Girl, and she'd never heard of it, she'd never heard of the Safaris, so I played it for her. Give me one moment. I'll play you a few bars. Enough, but it was quite a touching moment to play her that song and remind her of her lost love of 40 years past. I must admit, by the end of the interview process, it was hugely beneficial along with the archival research, along with the talking to Ellroy. But it was like, the thing with Ellroy is his life is kind of like a whirlwind. And you get sucked into that, life. And there were days that were extremely funny. But I now have a second reading for you, and this reading really shows you how kind of eccentric Ellroy could be, how fun he can be, and how farcical he can be.